Hello and welcome to this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. Today I speak to Professor Ed Mitchard, who is the chief scientist and co-founder of Space Intelligence Limited. This Edinburgh-based startup works towards increasing the ease of access to good quality information from satellite data for the conservation of forests. They help NGOs, companies, and governments map land cover and land cover change quickly. For example, to monitor supply chain zero deforestation commitments and ensuring national parks are genuinely protected. Not only do we talk about the great work space intelligence is doing, but we also talk about the growing field of remote sensing in conservation. Tune in to listen more and don't forget to share and subscribe to this podcast. Welcome, Ed, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
My first question for you is, what was the idea behind space intelligence and what is your long-term vision?
Sure. So I spent about the last 20 years measuring lots of trees in the tropics and developing better ways of using satellite data to map the carbon they store, and particularly looking at deforestation and forest degradation. I guess I realized with a lot of frustration in the mid 2010s that I was just developing better and better ways of watching the forests get degraded and shrink, and wasn't really part of the solution. I published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, and that was a good way of creating papers rather than necessarily protecting forests. So I started the company in 2018 with one of my colleagues at the University of Edinburgh, Murray Collins, and we kind of started it slowly. We ran it on the side as a way of supporting projects that were trying to avoid deforestation. So working with NGOs and small companies to provide really high quality maps of land cover and carbon. Lots of those types of projects just hadn't been using the latest satellite technology. And again, that was a frustration for me, and that was stopping these projects really doing as well as they could to sell carbon credits and use those to fund conservation. Company grew slowly, and then Murray Collins went full-time into the company in 2020, and it really took off from that point. And we're now 53 employees, I think, as of today, when we're producing maps of forest carbon and land cover change all around the tropics. In terms of where we're going, I guess I really want all forest conservation and forest restoration projects around the world to be using the latest satellite data. It doesn't have to be provided by Space Intelligence, but I guess our vision is for our company to grow rapidly, to carry on providing that need for really high quality data sets where there's a well-known uncertainty, so that when you buy a carbon credit, you have confidence that what you're buying really is protecting a certain number of tons of carbon from loss, from deforestation or degradation, or you're really able to monitor the growth of new forests that are being grown. And we have a fantastic suite of satellites up there now. Every spot on the Earth is monitored several times a day by different types of satellites, and we use a set of those and the data from throughout a year, along with advanced machine learning and artificial intelligence to get the most out of that information. So we really understand what's happening to this planet.
What exactly is remote sensing and how can it contribute to wildlife conservation and climate change mitigation?
Yeah, so there's three main types of what we call Earth observation satellites. So these are satellites that are pointed at Earth with sensors that try to understand something about the land surface. The simplest one are optical satellites. They're effectively a sophisticated camera looking at the Earth. If you look at Google Earth, you see the type of imagery they collect. They only see the very surface of, for example, a forest, so you don't see anything about what's happening under a forest canopy or under a grassland or a crop. But they still contain really rich information, and they actually look at a lot of wavelengths beyond what we see with our eyes. So we just see in red, green, blue, and there might be many more wavelengths going into the infrared that have information on forest structure and biodiversity. There are lots of satellites that collect that kind of data, including free and open data sets like NASA Landsat and Sentinel-2 from the European Space Agency and Copernicus programs. And we use that kind of free and open data with 10-meter pixel sizes normally, so a 10 by 10 meter square, having information on what the color is. That type of data is collected every 5 days across the world. So you get lots of observations over a year, and you can see the changes that happen with the seasons, for example. Next major type we use is something called synthetic aperture radar data. You often hear it called SAR, which is the acronym. I'll call it radar data as that's a bit easier to understand. That sends pings of microwave radiation at the surface and kind of listens for what comes back, produces these kind of grainy black and white images that look very weird. It's a kind of alien way to look at the surface, and radar data is used much less than optical data, mostly because it's really hard to interpret as a human unless you know what details of the physics of how it works. However, it's really useful for understanding what's happening with land cover and biomass, because it can see straight through clouds. Most of the world is cloudy most of the time, so that's a real advantage. And it can see through that top layer of vegetation, so you see the trunks and branches of the trees rather than just the green leaves on the very top. The final type we use is something called LiDAR data. That sends laser light, a single wavelength, straight down at the surface and listens again for the time it takes for that flash of laser light to come back to the satellite. And incredibly, even though the satellite might be hundreds of kilometers above the surface, the sensors are sensitive enough to detect the differences in the light return between the top of a tree and the ground and some of the reflections in between. And you can use that difference in the time of return to estimate the height of the forest canopy and something about the density of elements within that. So we use that LiDAR data in particular to give information on forest height and canopy cover, which we can then use to make maps of forest carbon. And that's really useful for tracking the amount of carbon in forests and seeing how that changes through time. We combine all those different data sets to make really good maps of land cover. I think I've mentioned that word a few times. That land cover is the type of vegetation or whatever on the ground surface in that 10 by 10 meter pixel. So that might be intact forest or grassland or agriculture or urban areas or degraded forest. Tracking those through time lets you map deforestation and degradation, also map ecosystem services and other relevant kind of point-based measurements you might make of biodiversity or whatever you need the land cover information to scale those up and track them through time. And the other thing we measure a lot is forest biomass. We produce estimates of that. But again, that allows you to track the carbon stored in above ground vegetation through time.
What have been some of the biggest challenges you have faced at space intelligence?
Yeah, well, I guess moving from academia to being an entrepreneur has a lot of challenges. So Murray and I mean, as academics, you do all kinds of different things, but we've never had to file accounts or work out how to navigate HR law, or we had funny things come up in the pandemic where we, to fulfill the legal requirements, we had to buy chairs and desks for all our employees or ensure that they had safe places to work at home. And the details of that kind of law was definitely a challenge. It's been a lot of fun growing a company and having the freedom to move quickly in a way that you just can't stuck in a very bureaucratic university system. So hiring people or moving quickly to address a problem has been great. I love the ability to start a project and get a map 6 weeks later that then has a real result in stopping deforestation. That immediacy is great. But yeah, I guess challenges in terms of growing a company, getting from that really small size, where as founders, you're doing every job that exists pretty much, to this larger size where you've hired hopefully the right people to do a lot of that finance and administrative work who are experts in it.
So what has been the broader impact that space intelligence has had till date?
Well, we provided maps that have protected a lot of tropical forest, which has been really nice to see. I love that direct link between, you talk to project developers who are working on the ground, genuinely helping communities stop their activities that were doing deforestation. So, for example, communities that were engaging in slash and burn agriculture for subsistence farming to grow the crops to feed their families, shifting them to, for example, the project in Peru we work with, where it's shifting them to growing cocoa trees. It takes quite a long time between planting a cocoa tree and getting cocoa. So the project supports them over that 7 to 10 years. And now those farmers are producing cocoa, which is something they can sell for premium chocolate. They're cash earning now, and that means they've moved out of poverty and a much more stable livelihood. Children are much more likely to go to school for longer periods and they have more opportunities, but also the forest is protected. And it's great that our data has powered that type of project. From a kind of bigger client point of view, we support Apple with their Restore Fund. So they are investing in projects around the tropics that grow restore forests, areas that have been deforested. They're trying to get back to a biodiverse, rich forest, and they use our data to help plan where they're going to put those forests and monitor them through time. And engaging with such a big efforts to restore lots of forest that has been lost and add that biodiversity as well as carbon. That's been a great thing to be involved with.
We talk a lot about the maps you guys make. Three main products: the canopy mapper, the carbon mapper, and the habitat mapper. Could you just talk a bit about these three different products?
Yeah, sure. So Canopy Mapper does what it says on the tin. It's the amount of canopy cover in a pixel, so a number from 0 to 100%. It's really useful for projects that are looking to find out where forest is. So often forest is not where is forest and where isn't forest isn't actually that simple a question. A lot of the world, it's based on a percentage of canopy cover, somewhere between maybe 10% and 30%. And so Canopy Mapper enables you to map where your forest is and see how that's changed, for example, a decade ago. So clients ask for that often when they're trying to plan where to put a forest restoration or a avoided deforestation project. Habitat Mapper, this is the land cover mapping. So pixels are given a land cover class, as I described earlier. Again, we often end up doing this for the present day and maybe 10 years ago to help projects understand how a landscape is changing and then how they should implement something to influence that change in the future. And the final one, these are increasing levels of complexity, is the carbon mapper, where we put each pixel, rather than saying it's forest or degraded forest or grassland, we give a number of tons per hectare contained in that pixel. So it might be 211 tons or whatever. That is very useful because forests are incredibly diverse. They're often in carbon projects kind of reduced down to a single carbon number across a vast area. So this forest is on average 200 tons per hectare. And that isn't true. It may be true on average, but some pixels could be 400 tons and some could be 100 tons. And it matters which ones you deforest then in terms of the carbon consequences. And it may be that the average pixel is not deforested, that loggers might target the high biomass pixels because those have the large trees in them. So we think it's really important to map the carbon storage of every pixel using the satellite data that's available and then track those through time. So you see often the low biomass pixels recover through time from past disturbance, and you can show that the high biomass pixels might be protected or might be being degraded.
Can you also elaborate a bit on your corporate offset program?
Sure. So we help big corporates kind of decide on which offsets to purchase. So we don't sell carbon credits. We're not in that business. We want to stay independent from the carbon credit side of things itself. We just sell maps of forest carbon and land cover. And I think that independence is important. But corporates do use our maps to validate the purchases they make of carbon credits and helping with their carbon offset decisions. So I gave the example earlier in this of Apple, who use our data to help them select projects and monitor them for their carbon offsetting. And we do the same for other large corporates. Our maps aren't actually being used to generate the carbon offsets. They're just being used to provide extra kind of confirmation that those carbon credits that they're potentially purchasing are real. These big companies are scared of being accused of greenwashing. They're trying to do the right thing, which is to reduce their own emissions as much as possible. And then where they can't reduce emissions further, to purchase carbon credits on the market to do that last bit. And then they're doing their bit towards reducing, for example, deforestation or restoring landscapes. But I think they're aware of the risks that's accused of being greenwashing. And in fact, it's like companies that do nothing seem to be off the hook. They're often not criticized at all. But they're using our data, these companies, to make sure that they're genuinely not doing any greenwashing and not supporting projects that aren't helping as much as they say they're helping on the ground.
What are some major gaps in the remote sensing field, and how can it be improved to better serve conservation?
So there is a fantastic set of free data available now that there wasn't decades ago. So back when I started my PhD in 2007, I had to fill in a paper form to access what's called a Landsat satellite scene from NASA and pay it was $550 for that scene. So obviously I had very few Landsat scenes to analyze. The Obama administration in 2009 made that Landsat archive of millions of Landsat satellite scenes free and open. The theory being that the American taxpayer had paid for these images, but American companies weren't really using them very much because they were so expensive, and maybe there'd be more benefits to the American economy by making these free and open, and then companies would use them and generate economic rewards, and people around the world would be able to use them, and that would maybe help with the environmental protection and other things. And that massively worked. Suddenly 100 or 1,000 times more people were using Landsat images. By the end of my PhD, I was using hundreds of thousands of Landsat images, really pushing the cloud computing capacity that we had at the University of Edinburgh at the time, to be able to make maps of all of Africa and how that was changing. That was great. And really, it's exploded since then. All the space agencies now are putting up satellites with free and open data, and there are 20 or 30 terabytes of open satellite data produced every day. Most of those satellite images are never used and never downloaded. And the biggest challenge now, I think, is not the data availability, but as a community, we have to be very smart about which images we use and how we process them. So at Space Intelligence, we have developed really good tools of selecting the right images that give us the maximum information about a pixel. We never download any scenes. We analyze those in the cloud. We bring our algorithms to the data that are stored by the big cloud providers. And we use all the information we need over a year to get a good idea of how a pixel is changing through the seasons, to help us understand what the biomass or land cover of that pixel is. But yeah, data and data processing is a big challenge. And I think many people trying to get into satellite data analysis are just overwhelmed by the volume of data these days, and maybe only scratch the surface of what's available because they try to do things in a more traditional way of downloading scenes to a laptop, and you just can't get the rich data that's available on something like a laptop. There are some good tools that have been developed to help. So there's something called Google Earth Engine, which is free to use if you're a university student or a non-profit organization. And that's fantastic. And that's really democratized access to some data. And there's others like that, Microsoft Planetary Computer, for example. But those still require you to code. And in some ways, they can make the analysis a bit easy. People don't necessarily know what they're doing fundamentally to the satellite data, and you can get weird artifacts and problematic results creeping in. But yes, I don't think the main challenge currently is the type of data. I'm not calling for new types of satellite to be launched. I think the challenge is that the data volume and finding the right satellite scenes to answer the problem you have.
Greatest learnings from
I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is to make sure if you're moving into a subject area to visit it and do detailed fieldwork there. I know your listeners are all about wildlife. I guess in my career, I've spent probably years cumulatively measuring trees in various tropical countries. I particularly worked in Central and Western Africa. So I've done long field campaigns in Cameroon and Gabon and Uganda and other countries, setting up field plots, camping in the forest, meeting and talking to local people, and genuinely you get a good understanding of the ecology of an area doing that. And that's really helped me in my career in terms of building algorithms to analyze satellite data. I feel very uncomfortable trying to make maps of an area of a type of ecosystem or forest that I've never visited or I don't fully understand. And I guess the papers I review that often have the biggest problems are ones that come from research groups where people just don't have an expertise in the area. For example, we have a way of doing forest plots in North America or Scandinavian countries that rely on these small circular forest plots that are set up randomly across a landscape. And those give a good idea of the timber volumes. That's what they were set up to do in the even-aged forests we have in some of these countries. And people have tried to transpose that method to the tropics, where you have uneven-aged forests with massive biodiversity and really enormous trees. And those small plots just don't work. They give incredibly high uncertainty estimates of forests, and they could work, but you'd need tens of millions of them across a country like Brazil, which is clearly impractical. And I think if the people who tried to set up those methods have actually been to tropical forests and understood that, they'd realize you needed much bigger forest plots, probably supplemented with satellite data, to be able to map those types of heterogeneous environments.
And my final question for this podcast is that how can individuals contribute to space intelligence?
Well, we're a company that produces maps, and a lot of those maps are public. You can go onto our website and look at our maps of Scotland's land cover, for example. So people in Scotland can go and look around the corner and tell us if our estimates of what the land cover change over their local area are genuinely right. In terms of contributing, I suppose we have sometimes hosted hackathons and other things where people can contribute directly to what we're doing. But yeah, I'd encourage everyone to go and look at the world from space as well as from our eyes. So you can always go to Google Earth or others and try and begin to understand how a satellite views what's going on Earth. In general, advice in terms of conservation and protecting forests is to look at your supply chain. The biggest change we can all make is to eat less meat and fly less. Those are two things that cause the biggest impact on climate change, in my view.